Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP. And first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video and subsequently visiting my channel. The topic of this video is going to be on racism. I will warn that this may be highly offensive, and so I'm just going to go ahead and proceed into the meat of the topic. So, first and foremost, I think that people's taking that is not really informed by the understanding of what human nature is. And nobody really asks, why are people racist? And then looks for an answer within the aspects of what constitutes human nature and the makeup of our social existence. Why is it the case that you have racist people? And that's a real question. And it should be one of scientific inquiry, but because there are such social political stances against these questions and the fact that the answers may be controversial in the sense that racism may actually have a legitimate genetic basis, people do not want to trek here, especially not in our current day and age, because many people are going to think, well, if racism has some genetic factor to it, or there's some evolutionary aspect to it, then that's a license or a credence for its practice. And first and foremost, I would say that that's not what I'm saying, but that anytime we're looking at something, we should have the best theoretical model in understanding it from the absolute precise standpoint an accurate standpoint, which we can, because that is the only way in which you're going to be able to potentially rectify a problem. You cannot place someone on the moon if you do not take into account the constraints of air resistance or air friction, gravitation, the lack of perpetual motion, and the other physical factors of aerodynamics and pressure, drag, flow, that come into doing something like that. If you never look at the reality of the actual empirical nature, then good luck in engineering a reliable solution. So, with that said, let's first understand what racism is and get a hard definition for it. At least one that can be, I guess, empirically leveraged in the sense that you could weigh this in a person. So, how quickly is a person going to judge a person based on their appearance? That's the first aspect of it. Racism is something that comes down to an evaluation of an individual on appearance first. Nextly, how likely is a person to think that their selves and their immediate group is something that ought to be valued. Not necessarily is the best, but ought to be valued in the sense that the value of me and my group comes first. Then the next thing you can say is, how likely is this person willing to be contentious for the sake of their group? And if you can measure all three of these things, then you will get a measure of ethnocentrism. You will get a measure of, let's just say, the factors that contribute to racism. So if you notice, the thing that I tie racism around is a group dynamic. And it is not the case that this is something that is particular to any group. It is the case, whether or not you're looking at any mammalian species, that typically the social collusive groups, and mostly primates' social collusive groups, are preferential inward. They are inwardly preferential, meaning they prefer those that come from their group. They prefer those that are their kin. They're preferentially inward. So if you're looking at chimpanzees, there's not a great deal of genetic difference from one chimpanzee group to another. In fact, there is really next to no difference in chimpanzees. But if chimpanzees, and I'm not saying human beings are chimpanzees, but let's just understand where some of these dynamics from a biological standpoint play themselves out in the animal kingdom, and then maybe we can create a more complex structure of understanding. If you have it the case that chimpanzees encounter a chimpanzee that is not of their troop, they will rip it apart. They will actually practice cannibalism. And if they don't kill it. If it's not a female, if they're not a female, but even if they're female, it's just touchy. Whether or not that the chimp from the outer group will be assaulted is higher than not in the likelihood of what this one group is going to do to the member from this rival group. And why do I bring that up? And I mean, this is something that's true for mice. It's something that's true for lions. It's something that's true for tigers. It's something that's true for deer. It's something that's true for any real group. Allowing any mammalian social inclusive kind of creature. Allowing an outsider in is highly unlikely, unless that outsider tends to present some value in the first place. Most groups are more likely to want to kill the outsider than to allow the outsider in. Even if the outsider is very genetically similar to them, which they're all genetically similar, but nature is a funny sort of thing in the sense that it deposes us to be interested in our own first. It makes sense in pheromones that are based on our own. We understand, see, all mammals, when I say we, understand and see difference based on scent, which is really why something smells a certain way has to do with just a few degrees of separation of genetic similarity. There is little to no genetic difference in most creatures, though we know from the way in which nature represents itself that you don't need a tremendous amount of difference in people or animals for there to be cascading differences in terms of the effects in which you watch how the phenomena of their interaction and the consequences of their performance or acting actually lay themselves out. So it is the case that nature in and of itself is something that tends to want to make a creature that is self-preferential. That's just the first thing that it is. And it's going to extend this self-preferential aspect to the kin next. So it's the case that whenever you look at, I guess, human behavior, it's the case that we don't deviate too far from this. I mean, even in some simple examples, there's a reason why in America people chose to have an elected official or a republic, because a hybrid democratic republic, because one of the things that our founding fathers really wanted to prevent was the advent of monarchies. Now, somehow Bush 1, Bush 2 got in there at the same time. We didn't let Bush 3 in there, but it's the case that we were trying to usurp this tendencies for human beings to be kin preferential rather than meritocratically preferential. We tend to want to give things to people, guess what? Either ourselves or people we like or prefer. And since our genes are embedded in our offspring or our kins, we tend to prefer them. On the most part, it's not the case that people are completely controlled by their biology or something like that. But when you're looking at human beings in terms of, what constitutes human behavior, do not assume human beings are conscious, rational agents, which is the problem. Whenever people are thinking about things like racism, they think, oh, well, this person is just a bigot or something like that. There's some kind of rational conscious functioning going on in this person. And it's not to say that they don't have ideas and thoughts and that they don't have to learn to be a certain way, but I'm going to try and present the argument to you here today that maybe you need to think of them more so like you think of a serial killer. It takes a certain kind of person. Not everybody's going to be that way. And also, but a little different from a serial killer, is that almost everybody has the makeup and the basis to be this thing. Now, whether or not you call it racism or sexism or some kind of ism, it is this idea of identity and preferentiality. What you identify with, and you identifying that with which you prefer over other things. And that's just how people are going to be in general. People, for example, you can take the actual existence of Mensa as a thing. People prefer like. Now, how far the abstract categories of like go, whether or not you're talking about individuals who have above a certain level of IQ, whether or not you're talking about fraternities or sorority houses or anything like that, whether or not you're talking about political parties, whether or not you're talking about sports team affiliations, like fantasy football leagues and things like that. This tendency for us to be inclusionally based and identifying preferentially is a very, 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 very ubiquitous human phenomenon, and it is the other side, or the more genteel side of racism. Now, racism, I'm not going to talk about it from a social biological standpoint in the sense, social historical, that's what I should say. I'm going to talk about it from a social biological standpoint purely. Now, having recognized that this thing of nature making people very much so first interested in themselves, then kin interested, this group dynamic is the factor of group selection. And racism is something of, if this group dynamic of identify with group, prefer that group, is a factor of group selection. And racism is a feature of group selection. Do not ever let anybody tell you differently. Now, it's not the case that it does not have its social components, because it certainly has its social components. I'm just the type of person that believes this, that regardless of what people say why they believe something or think something, chances are there's a set of emotions and motivations that are behind them holding those beliefs in the first place. They don't just kind of spring up out of the void. If there wasn't some kind of biological sort of makeup to human beings in the first place, they would not be able to entertain or have such ideas or thoughts. And so this is the kind of thinking that I have when it comes to racism, though I am not saying I'm a biological determinist, but I do think that if you think that there is not a big incentive out in nature for some of what we consider socially our worst angles, I think you are not paying attention. So it's the case that, why do people like to have big families? Let's start with, why do people like to have big families? Whenever you're looking at the evolution of human beings from, I suppose, a hunter-gatherer based creature to being an agriculturally based creature, then you're looking at the new advent of the idea of, so we've always had tribes per se, but it's not the case that once we got into hunter-gatherers, once we left hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural ones, that it was very clear how hierarchies and dynamics were going to set themselves up completely. You did have an increase of violence, and you did have an increase of pestilence, and you did have an increase of war. All of these things are kind of the functions that ironed out this hierarchy. But why did war and violence actually become something that was much more common in human societies when you get agriculture? Well, it's the case that if everybody is going to be sustaining their existence based off of the resources that are divvied up in this land, you're going to look at a landscape of opportunity. And let's talk about the Kennedys. So I know it seems like I'm going on a tangent here, but just follow it for a second. Let's talk about the Kennedys. The Kennedys are a good example of this. You found a Kennedy in everything and everywhere. Why did you find a Kennedy in everything and everywhere in American history? Because there were a lot of them. Now, let's think about our agricultural situation. Whenever you look at that landscape as a thing of a distribution of resources and opportunities, it's going to be the case that if you have a lot of children and if you have a loyal extended family, then guess who's going to get a majority of those opportunities? Your family, your progeny, your genes. I'm not saying I'm somebody who's a believer in Richard Dawkins' selfish genes, but I think that we give a little too much privilege to the rationality in mankind and don't pay enough attention to the irrationality in mankind, because we're like Dan Irely says, we're predictably irrational creatures. So, if you want to be able to predict anything about a person, is that there's something about them that's irrational. You can hang your hat on that one. Moving from that, it's the case that there is a definite evolutionary incentive for us to, within a situation like that, to try to make large extended family groups. Now, sometimes, and as history and social things act themselves out, we make allegiances with various other groups and so on and so forth. There's a reason why monotheism arose in agricultural regions. Now, what those conditions are necessarily, I can't tell you, but I'm just going to put it like this. Whenever you have a lot of people who are distantly related in one way or another, and they're all together, then there is going to be already a factor of self-preferentiality. Now, self-preferentiality is born most in self and then next greatest in kin. But when you have a collusion, because human beings didn't travel for very long, and whenever they needed more space, they would grab all of the able sitting body men, because you had leisure and things like that, and they would take over another space. They would just go and kill the next group over and take their land. Now, if it's the case that you have this whole thing about gathering opportunities in an environment for your family, and then you have this thing about the group itself needs to sustain itself on the ever so shrinking opportunities and resources in the land, and then the next best option for you to do is to go over and take it from the next group. Guess what? You have a group selective matrix that asks for people to prefer their group first. And since everybody who's going to be in the same space is going to be basically 12 degrees separated by relation, because, well, human beings, I mean, there's a lot of sexual diversity, don't get me wrong. I mean, we've been swapping genes with one another in neighboring, people groups and things like that. That always happened. I mean, there's always been gene flow and things like that between two breeding populations, including human beings. But nature's funny. It doesn't actually need for there to be a real difference in people for it to motivate people to believe and think of a strict difference between myself and them, and then to capitalize on that difference in order for the, let's just say, proliferation of an individual that is nested within a group, because it's where we get the idea to some extent where if the individual thrives, then the group thrives. And we think like that to a certain extent because of our pre-history evolutionary makeup, that we're creatures that are supposed to be a social animal in a particular hierarchy that works more so in a quasi democratic slash hierarchy. It's a little messy in what it is. All people are relatively the same except for a few individuals where one individual tends to dominate the space, but not completely and entirely, because human beings are a bit more complicated than chimpanzees. And so that's why we have so many different ebbing flows and types of government that come out of us, because, well, we're not exactly one thing. That's something that's very funny about human beings. We're not exactly one thing, not like other animals. We tend to be very plastic and adaptable. We fit these kind of hybrid schemes a lot better than this little narrow, singular kind of linear picture we have of other animals, but even other animals are turning out to be much more complicated than we first thought that they were. Go figure. We're fundamentally ignorant, and we're learning more as time goes on. But with that said, it's just a case that whenever you're looking at agricultural societies, the agricultural societies are the first place where you get the incentive for racism. And why are agricultural societies the first place that you get the incentive for racism in people? Because, look, if you're a young male and you don't have much land or own anything, the Vikings are a good example of this. then one of the ways in which you can bring glory to yourself and your people and increase your status is to go out and pillage and take things from other people. Now, not everybody did that, but agricultural societies are very much so known for not being so nice with their neighbors. They did not exactly play nice with their neighbors. A lot of human beings like wiped one another out as they got closer and closer and closer to one another, or they oftentimes integrated one another. So if they couldn't wipe one another out, or they didn't want to wipe one another out for whatever reason, then their genes just melded to the point where there was one people group at the end over the turn of the evolutionary draw. People are pretty sure that's what happened with Jewish people. Jewish people are kind of a mess of different Mesopotamian individuals, or ancient Hebrews are kind of a mesh of different Mesopotamian groups that coalesced into one genetic breeding pool, like at some point in time in history. And so that's something that happens a lot. I mean, we're pretty sure that the Greeks, killed other people in the area that were around them and pushed them up north or away from them. None of this is for certain, but it's just looking like that evidence is showing that either people groups assimilated when they got very close to one another, or they eradicated one another. And that probably doesn't sound surprising to people. Now, whenever you look at the eradicating factor, there you have it be the case, well, even probably the assimilating factor, because I don't know. So, I mean, I really can't say, but I will put it like this. Like, there's two different strategies. You can either get along and integrate, or you can dominate. And so why would people want to dominate? Well, guess what? Because they get what they want. Like, it's in their best interest. It depends on the luck of the draw, per se, in terms of what strategies really showed themselves to be valuable to a certain group at a particular time, and they're just going to carry that with them for the rest of their evolutionary history. Because that's how nature works. It doesn't play a different game so long as that one works. If it works once and it keeps working, then we're going to keep it going. And we're not going to stop it until it proves itself to be untenable. And even then we're going to lobby for it as much as we want, because nothing likes to adapt and nothing likes to change. So let's look at the Vikings, okay? So you have a young male that goes out and pillages and takes and kills off these other groups. Well, they're rewarded in their society for doing so. You have to think about it like this too, from the standpoint of an agriculturalist. If your people group is running out of a bunch of land, and then there's this next people group over here, and they're kind of dopes. Nobody really dislikes them, but nobody also values them to a strong extent, because they're not within this referential framework of what's going on in your little agricultural society. If you go out and wipe them out and they're like, hey, everybody, we got new food and land and everything like that, people are going to say, yeah, that's our guy. That's our people, because that's where the idea of our people comes from. Us in competition with local groups. And it's always been us in competition with local groups. Because that's even true for Africa, man. Africans are racist against other Africans. Take the Hutus and the Tutsis, for example. And the differences in them genetically is very limited, but there are differences in religious beliefs and so on and so forth. And you look at that little narrative, and, well, you have a genocide and everything like that. It's something that's pretty ubiquitous across the human landscape. You look at how many... I do not think, if anybody looks at the history between the Japanese and the Chinese, that anybody's going to ever say that was a lovely one. It seems like we've always been in the business of trying to wipe out the other group. That's just what we seem to have done. Now, it's the case that we're something that works in the sense that whatever is successful, that's what's reproduced. So you can believe that those individuals who first decided to prefer their groups over other groups were the ones that got most of the success. And then if they're the ones that got most of the success, they're the ones that are passing down most of the genes, and they're the ones that are also dictating a lot of what is socially normative, or what the expected roles and things for an individual are, what it's expected for people to believe. That's just the way that it is. Even if you go to Japan right now, since Japan has had an influx of foreign occupants, they're many individuals from various European countries have immigrated to Japan in some way or another, and you have it because of this that there are Japanese only signs even in Japan, because what racism is a preference for your group, and it's a preference for your group in the sense of ethnocentrism is something that preserves. It keeps your group around. That's why you go out and take land. That's why you go and kill these other groups. That's why you go and do your imperialism thing, because it's just about keeping us around. Racism is just about keeping that group around. That's all it wants to do. Just keep it around. You know, it's like why all of the irrational fervor can be attached to this supremacy of one group over the other. And that's not unique to white people. I mean, you listen to, you go to the Middle East, man, that's another place where, you know, there's not a lot of genetic difference between people, but don't tell them that, you know, like, don't tell them that, you know. And it's funny because there really isn't, you know, there's not much difference from any particular group to the next in terms of our genes. That may cause people to believe that there's no such thing as race or ethnicity. That's not true. There are real things that there are real factors to race and ethnicity, but biological race and biological ethnicity, the social problem, I'm not going to touch that at all, but it's a social, there is race as a social construction, and then there's race and ethnicity as a biological thing. And so that's the problem with race too. It's a rather ambiguous thing, because sometimes when people talk about race, they mean ethnicity, and those are not necessarily synonymous. But I say race and ethnicities just so I cover the whole gambit. Now, moving on. So people tend to think that you look at America or someplace like someplace like that where racism was in its, people say, worst form, that was something that was unique and new to it. No, man, like, no, sir, no, it's not, you know, from this standpoint. So you look at everybody who is or you look at American history. So I'm not saying white people are the devil or anything like that. So don't let this talk, you know, be something that influences you to think that I think that, because I happen to be part white, whether people know it or not. I happen to be partly European, Western European. So it's the case that I don't hate white people, but I will say this. Whenever you look at American history, it was the case that there were other people here first. Now, Native Americans weren't exactly the friendliest individuals either, so, you know, whether or not people want to talk about the victims that they were or they weren't. Some Native American groups were friendly, but Native American tribes were not necessarily friendly with one another. So they were not very keen on their European visitors or invaders, however they saw it. And it's not the case that it started off as an invasion. In fact, the Native Americans met the Vikings, and guess what? When the Native Americans and the Vikings met, what do you think they did? They fought, you know, because there's something about human nature in the sense that this is mine, I own it, we were here for our group, get the fuck out. That's a real motivation, because nature is a harsh thing, you know. We want to look at human beings as something as creatures that are independent of nature and its influences and actions. And it's true that we have rationality, and we have rationality. That doesn't mean we're rational. Just pay attention to that difference there. And we can certainly make decisions, but we are very, 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 very much so creatures of social learning and plasticity at this point in time in our, I guess, evolutionary history. I'm going to get to the modern predicament in a bit, but here's what I will say is true, is that Native Americans and Vikings fought, you know. It's not that, you know, the Native Americans had a word for the Vikings that meant something like the devil, and the Vikings had a word for the Native Americans that meant something like the scourge or the plague or something like that. So that tells you a little bit about the psychology of what a group has when it encounters another group that seems to be keen on what it has. Not in the sense that things, even sharing. Look at little kids, man. It's not like people are too keen on sharing, It's like if one kid has a toy or has a group of toys, say, behind them, they're not really playing with them or anything like that. One kid may just ask, can I play with it? Not can I have it, not saying I want it, or not saying I want it for any extended period of time, just that I would like it for a few moments to enjoy it, for the sake of whatever, these few seconds there. A little bit of joy and fun. We can even play together. One kid is just going to be like, no. No, 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 no. And these are just the kids that are not at least a little more than mildly agreeable. Children who are agreeable and who are mildly agreeable and higher are less likely to act like this because their self-interest is in getting along with other people, but that doesn't mean that they're not self-interested. So notice the caveat there. It's just the case that other people display their self-interest in the sense that they're like, effing mine. Stay the F away, mother trucker. And it's not the case that siblings don't even act this way with one another. So it's like, take the story of take the story of Cain and Abel in the Bible, man. It's like, it's something fundamental to human nature. It's not the case that you don't have, or at least it's something that has been greatly adapted and exercised throughout our history. And it lives on several tiers of resolution. There is the self, there is the kin, and there is the group. And we're going to stick in that kind of stratosphere first. And everybody identifies themselves with a certain kind of group. A certain kind of thing. Whether that's individuals or something like that. It's just the categories can get very abstract, but it's just the case that whenever you're looking at racism, that's one of the oldest categories of all of human history. We have only really known ourselves as ourselves. And then we looked up and saw, wow, there is another. Now, sometimes the others and the another became one. That's why there are those mythologies in the world. But oftentimes, depending on the regions, especially ones that were dry and arid, where there's not very many resources, ones where it's very cold and it's very harsh, you get violence. So that's what happens, man, because guess what? Nature's trying to kill you, and there's this other group over there that has something you want. Nature's trying to kill you. Everything else seems to kill everything else around in this environment, so we're just going to kill one another, and we're not going to really think anything funny of it. Now, don't let that make you think that racist people don't have any actually, they're very familial. So that's the one thing that people misunderstand about racist people. Racist people are extremely familial in the sense that they are very, 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 very keen on in-group aspiration, trying to be the highest thing in that group for the group. They're also very much so about loyalty, being extremely loyal to a fault. They're also very much so against in-group competition. So it varies. It certainly varies. People have their own personalities and things like that. There's more variation within groups than outside of them. So certainly you have the case that, things happen, but it is definitely so the case that you don't go around killing your own kind. This is something that's a part of racism. It's why when people think, in the Bible it says, thou shalt not kill. Everybody's like, it says thou shalt not kill, but they went out and killed the Canaanites or the Hittites and so on and so forth, and the Jebusites. Well, had you ever thought that was ethnocentrically saying thou shalt not kill? You don't kill your neighbor. And that's what Jesus was really coming to talk about to Jewish people. It's back in the day, it was this way. Mostly back in ancient Hebrew days, it was mostly everybody was closely related to one another in some way, some form. They all considered themselves children of Abraham. And two, people who decided that they were going to take on their culture and their customs and basically become Hebrew people were also exempt. So Jewish people were a little ahead of their time in the sense that, you could declare Hebrew nationality. Ancient Hebrew people were a little ahead of their time in the sense that you can declare ancient Hebrew nationality if you were not originally a child of Abraham or something like that. But they did not hold those sympathies very far, because if you were someone outside of that group, they would cut you down just like any other group, even though they are moral or they had the Ten Commandments and Yahweh was leading them and so on and so forth. There are a lot of people and people groups that disappeared and they were conquered by other groups. But you notice even in the conflict of the New Testament, there's a certain kingdom that got taken over, and instead of remaining unique and individual to its own, integrated with those people, with the Syrians and little southern Jerusalem was not happy about that and thought those people were less than them, even though they were all half Jewish, which is a funny thing. So, and it's a real thing, because look, anytime you don't show preference to your group and you have been selected to be a group preferential thing, you are the wrong kind of thing. You are the immoral thing. Something that is not group interested, meaning it's group first, is fundamentally immoral to the group ethnocentric mind. That is just how it works. Don't be fraternizing with them boys over there. Don't be doing this. It's like, that's how it works. And that's not an accident, because that is a strategy. Racism is an evolutionary strategy. And if you look at the way in which certain, outcomes have distributed themselves across history, this has been a very successful one. And when people look at the shape of the world, nobody really wants to slice up the dynamics from the standpoint of, it made sense for a time because guess what? It worked. But now we just have modern sensibilities. And let's talk about our modern sensibilities. So our modern sensibilities work something like this. So let's take modern sensibilities. I mean, America, for example, America has the attitudes and things like it has towards racism and whatever and whatnot based on the historical fact of it. So there's a lot of things that lead America to be what it was. The Greeks, certain Greek states, were open-minded in the sense that, you could come be a part of the Greek or the Roman Empire. Now, you couldn't have a lot of status in either of those cultures. With the Greeks, it depended on how intelligent you were, basically. You didn't necessarily have to be genetically Greek to, be a Greek. So long as you exalted your city-state, you made your city-state great, they were pretty okay with you. Similarly, the Romans allowed people to be a part of their societies and things like that, but it was like you were never Roman. So that was one of the Pax Romana. So that's one thing you got to know. Look, I don't know what genes make Romans, but they were very clear on the fact that, look, what's most supreme, even the Greeks, man. So, it's us supreme first, everybody else inferior second. Like, that's how human nature tends to go. I mean, you look at Italians. Why do Italians think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread? You look at any group, Armenians, whether or not you're talking about Jewish people, whether or not you're talking about black people, whether you're talking about white people, or Chinese, or Korean, or whatever, most from a group tends to prefer their group first. Now, you may look at that and say, oh, that's just normal. Birds of a feather flock together. Guess what? That's racism. That's where it comes from. It's all that. It's just the case that across history, we've tempered it, per se, or we've adapted it to new sorts of things. But think of BET, okay? Black Entertainment Television. Let's just talk about it for a second. That's fucking racist, man. It's not racist in the sense that, I would just put it like this. So it's funny to me that whenever it's the case that people talk about having our own something. So our image is not represented in the media, and we need a black person to represent our image and our interests, because there is no other, there's social reasons for that. There's absolutely social reasons for that. I'm going to phrase it like this. I'm going to say it like this. That I would think this. If the world was not governed by, if human dynamics to a certain extent, barring certain personality types, and I'll get into that later on, was not governed by racism, you would not have it that birds of a feather flock together, be an idiom or an expression. And you would not have it that people tend to want to refer to people that look like them and come from similar backgrounds as them, because this whole thing about preferring self first, it's a outpour of the tendency for self-preferentiality. That's what it all is. And so whenever you look at racist people and things like that, don't ever think that they're not agreeable. And don't ever think that they're not very loyal or something like that to themselves. They just don't have any preference, care, concern, or love for other people. In fact, they don't mind other people, but they will get you out of their way if you stand in the way of the goals of their group. And that can have mild expressions and it can have very violent expressions. But let's talk about the violence, because people tend to like to say that that's just something that, is in Europeans or something like that. But last time I looked at human history, I would say that there is no freaking peace-loving group out there that doesn't happen to be some type of religious sect. And even with the religious individuals, it's not like violence is something that is scant in human history or is something that's unique to a particular type of group. I'm not saying I agree with Nietzsche in the sense that there are winners and losers, but there is definitely the case that, everybody practiced violence. Some people won from that practice of violence. Some people did not win in that practice of violence. It's like where people were practicing violence really is something that's going to be dependent on the social evolutionary factors within that given region. Like Africa was not exactly a peaceful place, maybe it's still not a peaceful place, but it wasn't exactly a peaceful place maybe 500 to 1,000 years ago. It's not the case that you have African nations and things like that from a lack of warring between African people. I'm not saying that, African people are warmongering or something like that, but I am saying that human nature tends to be warmongering to a certain extent. You look at the Middle East. I mean, why is the world characterized by conflict? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Why does it seem to be the case that there tends to be mostly conflict in the world, and most of our efforts are here to mitigate conflict or to reduce the amount of overall violence and conflict in the world? Notice that one? It's just the case that, there's a kind of animal that we are. And that's maybe one thing I'll miss from, the Bible, in the sense that it says certain things about human nature in terms of the fact that we're not fucking angels, man. Like, we're not, and it's like, it's not a mystery to me why people are racist. And I don't tend to take the stance that racism is immoral. I tend to take the stance of this. It's a fact, And if it's something that you tend to have issues with or a problem with, you're going to have to understand it from the standpoint of a fact and not a set of modern sensibilities. You're going to have to very much so realize to a certain extent that nature, we selected for it. Maybe we didn't select for it from the standpoint of, our immediate group selected for this, but this goes way, 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 way back. People didn't just start evolving today, It's like, why do we have serial killers? Man, it takes psychopathy, or a lot of people are just gonna say, well, Joshua, that's just genetic flukes or anything and things like that. Why can you have sociopaths and why can you have psychopaths in the first place? Because human beings are not angels. There's something about the utility of violence. There's something about the utility of lying, manipulation, and coercion that is something that's embedded in our DNA. It's better for us to be irrational in terms of our own interests. It's better for us to be hyper from the standpoint of better. When I say better, I mean evolutionarily more adaptive. So, why are people extroverted? Because, extroverted people will go out into the world and take a risk, and they have a higher chance of being successful because they're like that. Why is it the case that people have the capacity to lie? Because sometimes it makes sense for you to get the jump on the competition, whether or not that competition is your neighbor, your brother, or your whoever. It's like competition is situationally dependent on and with respects to your current state of motivations and the context of the situation. because reality right now, or at least society, American societies, are so damn peaceful, we very much so underestimate the mammalian nature that's a part of us. It's like it's why it exists in various movies, the expression. So take Batman, for example, The Dark Knight. So one of the theories that the Joker had about people was that when chaos abounds, they're going to really turn on one another and they're going to be nasty and brutish and things like that. And there's a reason why we think those things. Maybe in the movie, because there are certain kinds of moral and ideological beliefs that didn't occur. But whether or not that does occur within a society is basically a dice roll. It depends on the financial, political stability of the place for the past 500 years, which determines how people are really going to respond in a situation like that. It's the case that racist people would rather eat themselves than eat their group. They would rather eat others than eat their group. They're very group first. They take very serious pride and stock in their group, and that's a personality. That's not purely socially based or political. And it's the case that religion didn't exactly disincentivize people from being this way. In fact, religiosity and ethnocentricity have a serious correlation across any group. You look at Islam or you look at Christianity. There's a reason why Christianity is very popular in China, because if you look at what's in China, it's mostly Chinese people. Christianity is a very particular kind of religion from an evolutionary standpoint that seems to work best in ethno-homogeneous landscapes. So when everybody is of the same race and ethnicity, Christianity seems to be very, very popular. And so, that's not, to me, that's not a coincidence, And it's because of the evolutionary history of things from a social biological standpoint and a purely biological standpoint. If you have a creature that is not self-interested, and if you have a creature that is completely rational, and you have a creature that isn't going to divvy up and play best with where the power sits with respects to itself and its, nature, then you're going to have a dead creature. Because nature's not in the business of morality. Nature is in the business of effectiveness. And in terms of what racism is from the standpoint of a social biological strategy, it's a highly effective one. Because when you look at even, take the Middle East, or take China, or take Japan, and so on and so forth, the groups that tended to want to occupy and dominate a region of them and them alone, and were successful in their conquest of this, tend to have the most capital, and they tend to have relatively high IQs on average. It's just the case that, well, to our modern ears and our modern eyes, how could you say such things? But when you roll back the tail of the tape and you look at nature and you look at human beings in terms of their nature from an anthropological standpoint, which there is a great deal of evidence that we were not very kind to those who lived around us. Now, some early human societies were somewhat matriarchal or more democratic, but they don't exist. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, There have been several different variations of human beings, but there's a reason why there's only one kind of animal really around this day and age. Because whether or not we like the fact or not that we're a certain kind of animal, it's the case that he who survives is he who thrives at the end of the day. Or she, or, because women aren't very different, I mean, you can go back to just photos of America around the 50s and the 40s, and you will see plenty of women holding signs that this is a white neighborhood only, It's not like this is something that's unique to men, because one of the things I dislike about modern criticism is it tends to make too much of a dichotomy between the motivations of men and women. It's like they're not very different creatures in certain ways in terms of their overall evolutionary motivation. Everybody wants to win. Go figure. And so that's what's going on. It doesn't mean that we're not moving to a new place. It doesn't mean that there isn't a type of social evolution happening right now. But whenever we're thinking about this problem, a lot of times people need to phrase it as, extending our groups. And that's really what most people are talking about when they're talking about social incentives for us to get along better with one another. We have to start seeing other people as important to our existence and our survival. That's hard for people, but the more you can do it, the more successful you are, which comes to my point right now. The reason why the world is becoming more agreeable is because we have incentives for there to be more agreeable people in the world than disagreeable people. But I tell you that any kind of system or sway to a particular persuasion is just another evolutionary selective factor. Like there was an evolutionary selective factor to get us to be racist, group preferential creatures, unless you're open. So let's just be frank. Open people are a different kind of creature because, well, they're open. So, they're going to be creatures that roam about various landscapes and tend to try to make for themselves off of the spur of the moment. Open people are best in chaos. So racism comes from the fact that groups stabilized certain areas and made societies and civilizations out of them. We have civilizations because of racism. We have agriculture, we have racism we have racism because of various biological factors that prove to be very powerful in the establishment of the dominance of groups in various agricultural settings. So that's how we get racism. But civilizations put racism on the map, and you better believe imperialism rocketed that sucker up to the highest degree. I mean, look at Europe, for God's sakes. I mean, there's not very much difference between the French and the German. I mean, French people are a type of German people that had various evolutionary factors that happened to them. Similar with British people. British are freaking German, it's like Scandinavians, all of them, they're all very similar, they just have slight differences in different cultural practices. And thus you have war, and more warmongering after the advent of Christianity and the dominance of Christianity in the West. And it's funny that Christianity did not get violence out of people, and Christianity did not make people think any more so that, those damn Germans over there, those damn Irish, or those damn Scottish and things like that. It's just like, it's in us, It's the case that we're moving further and further and further away from it. It seems to have less and less correlation with people who are open and who are agreeable, but that doesn't mean open and agreeable people are better than other people. It's just a different kind of adaptation. And it's the case that we should try to get racist people to come into the new world with us, rather than see them as things to be hated and villains and things like that. There's something valuable about the way that they are. I'm not saying that racist people are good. I'm trying to communicate that it's not a moral thing for me, but any person who can go out and dominate the world and subjugate it to a particular order has value. Any group that can do that has value, which is why, whether people want to admit it or not, certain groups get integrated in other groups for various reasons. And so that's my take on racism. I think if people hate white people, they're just being very, very naive. And I think if people hate any other kind of group and think that one group is more racist than the next, then I think that they're very, very naive. And that's my take on it. So that's racism from the most impartial stance I can have based on biology and anthropology. That's my video, and thank you for watching.